If you train jiu-jitsu and you're over the age of 40, you've probably made some observations.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
My name's Coach Alex Sterner from Electrum Performance, and I want to go through a few things that should help you in this process. So we're no longer 18. What's changed? If you go on any over 40 for BJJ forum on Facebook, anywhere on the internet, you'll hear tons of people saying that the only solution is TRT. There are absolutely some valid applications for that. It's not a catch-all be-all. Let's go through some of those other variables that are important. The first, and probably the most noticeable, is injuries. How do we deal with them? Is it possible to prevent them? Are kettlebells magic? We have people who support the use of kettlebells and claim that their kettlebell flow will fix your body. How dangerous is heavy lifting? You hear people with horror stories where they deadlifted and their L5 shot out and bounced across the room like a hockey puck.
I broke my back, spinal.
Is that gonna happen to you? Is that something we should be scared of? Is it maybe a useful tool for us to prepare our body for jiu-jitsu? Does lifting really make you less flexible? We've all trained with that training partner who's able to throw that leg in from, us being 95% past the guard. And if you have any of that mobility, the last thing we want to do is lose it. So will lifting potentially get in the way of that? And don't you get weaker as you get older? Is that essentially a lost cause? And the last thing that we're going to look at is recovery. It might seem crazy if you're already super sore from jiu-jitsu, how adding anything else in could be beneficial. So how would we go about doing that? A lot of us have heard old wives' tales or rumors that injuries come from lack of flexibility. But for this particular example, I really like to use sort of an extreme example to highlight a point. If I were to fall out of a second-story window and get hurt from it, it didn't happen because I was not flexible enough or I didn't warm up for it. My body encountered forces that exceeded different tissues' capacity to absorb or mitigate those forces. And due to that, I experienced an acute injury. Now, that might be a gross oversimplification. Injuries are extremely multifaceted, but a huge component of acute injuries is our body's capacity to absorb or mitigate forces. So that brings us to load tolerance. Now, a lot of us are very familiar with the load tolerance of muscles, right? If you can bench press 180 pounds, the muscles associated with that motion can tolerate a certain amount of weight in the eccentric or lowering and then the concentric phase. As we get stronger, little by little, we're able to tolerate greater loads. Now, muscles are obvious because we can see them, but as we go through progressive incremental strength training, it's not just the muscles that go through changes. Our tendons, bones, and ligaments all remodel and often hypertrophy to account for greater loads or stressors. And this directly makes us harder to injure. So when injuries do inevitably happen, it's also really valuable that we're able to manage acute injuries. Do we rest? Do we just push through it? In general, it's not going to be that binary choice. We want to really establish a setting where we have a degree of control. So if we think about it, with training partners, we probably don't have a huge degree of control, particularly if we're doing live sparring. But in the weight room, we actually have control over everything that we do. One of the first things that we want to do when we're dealing with an acute injury is to remove variables that are outside of our control and focus on a lot more things that we have direct control over. If it hurts to pick up a 45-pound dumbbell, we probably want to scale that back for a bit. We establish whatever capacity we have immediately following the injury, and then we generally want to come up with a plan. I call it a staircase, to slowly bring us back to the level of activity that we were at previously. The biggest mistake that we see people make as they're managing an acute injury is they rest for a period of time, pain is no longer present, then as soon as pain is no longer present, or at least not as persistent as it was, they jump right back into the activity that they were doing previously. And what that can do is really leave us predisposed to a much more significant injury down the line. Instead, what we should do is regress to whatever capacity we have and create a plan. Come up with different checkpoints at different stairs that get us back to training, to live sparring, if that's something that is a priority for us. So for example, we would probably want to be able to train most movement patterns in the weight room before we get back to drilling. And when we do start drilling, we're gonna start with ones that are less painful or much more manageable and slowly progress to ones that were problematic from the start. Once we've established that we can train in every position, we can then start to get to specific situations and eventually regular live rounds. Doing so will give us our best shot to avoid a recurring or more serious injury to those same tissues. The last thing we want to get into is the role of isometric exercises in pain management. Let's go through a few examples. Isometrics are a great way to manage pain and prepare us for further activity. Something like a wall sit requires no equipment and allows us to warm up an area like the knees for something like squats or Jiu Jitsu. Bands can also be a really useful tool to apply isometrics to different parts of the body. In this case, I'm using a band to apply load to the shoulder in a way that it can tolerate even if I'm dealing with some aches and pains. So if we've established that we want to begin strength training to improve our ability to absorb or mitigate forces, what implements or what equipment should we use? A lot of us have probably heard of some functional patterns guru spinning around like a Beyblade, claiming that kettlebells are the best piece of equipment that we need. And this might not exactly be true. Any piece of equipment can be really useful in the right context of a strength training program. We can use barbells, dumbbells, kettlebells, bands, and even machines to increase our body's ability to produce or tolerate force. There are a couple things that we want to keep in mind though. The most important thing is progression, particularly over the long term. For this reason, things like barbells and machines are a great choice because they allow us to increase load over time. If we don't have access to barbells or machines, that doesn't mean that it's a hopeless endeavor. Another really important variable is convenience. If you only have your body weight and maybe some limited equipment at home, a couple kettlebells, a couple dumbbells, it doesn't mean that we can't improve simply because we don't have a full array of barbells or machines. There's plenty of ways that we can progress over time. We can add reps, we can add pauses to exercise. We can increase training density, how much we do over time. So there's lots of ways that we can establish a baseline and make progress, even if we don't have the perfect implements available. And then the last thing we want to keep in mind is variety. How much is ideal? We want to have a degree of repetition that we continue over the course of 4 weeks. A typical training program will run for 4 to 8 weeks. And on day 1 of that training program, it'll be the same exercises for weeks 1, 2, 3, through the end of the program. That repetition is key. Over time, as we then change our program at the end of each month or 8 weeks, we do want to have some variety, but variety is far less important than a lot of fancy Instagram exercises will have you believe. Have a well-rounded array of exercises, cycle through those periodically every 4 to 8 weeks, and really aim to improve in terms of your execution and your overall performance in those movements throughout the course of those 4 to 8 weeks. So I understand we went over a lot today, and preparation for something as complex as Jiu Jitsu can be a little bit confusing. That's why I've made it my mission to offer a service like Team EP that allows me to do the thinking for you off the mats. It allows us to train and emphasize range of motion, determine what our minimum effective dose is, and really push for long-term progress, not just in terms of performance, but in terms of resilience and our ability to prevent or mitigate injury. So if that sounds like something useful to you, check out the link down below and be sure to subscribe, like the video, and share it with somebody who could use it.